In this video, we're answering the question that probably every pivot table user has asked at some point: how to clear old items from a pivot table filter list. So here we can see a pivot table, and we have Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Echo. And you can see those same items in our source data table. Yet for some reason, we have this item in our slicer called Delta. And when we click on the filter list, we also see that Delta exists in that filter list. But it's not there. Delta isn't there in the source data. How can this happen? Well, that's what we're going to answer in this video. But before we go any further, I recommend you download the example file for this video. Then you'll be able to work along with the examples and see the solution in action. And you'll be able to find links in the descriptions box below. So once you've done that, let's get started. So first of all, why does this happen? Well, every time that we refresh a pivot table, it's actually updating the pivot cache. And the pivot cache is an unseen part of Excel, which stores a copy of the source data. By having a copy of this data in the pivot cache, it ensures that pivot table calculations are fast. So when we refresh a pivot table, we're actually refreshing the data that's held within the pivot cache. Not only does the pivot table cache contain a copy of the data, but it also has its own settings that govern how that data is used. One of the default behaviors of the pivot cache is that it retains a list of previously used unique values. And that's what we're seeing in our scenario here. Our source data previously contained an item called Delta. Therefore, the pivot cache has retained this as a unique item. But that's enough of the why. Let's look at how we can fix it. So to clear old items from the pivot table drop-down list or slicer, we just have to change one setting. So I'll right click on my pivot table and I'll go down to pivot table options. The pivot table options dialog box will open and I can click on the data tab. In there we see this section that's titled retain items deleted from the data source. And within there, number of items to retain per field. That's currently set to automatic. I'll click on that drop down and change it to none, and then click OK. Now all I have to do is refresh my pivot table. Look at that. Fantastic. All those redundant historic items have now disappeared. And when we use that pivot table going forwards, it will no longer retain any historic items. Just a couple of notes on this. Firstly, this setting applies to the pivot cache. So any pivot table that's built upon that same pivot cache will automatically be updated as well. Secondly, if you build pivot tables using the data model rather than the pivot cache, it won't suffer with this problem because the data model doesn't have this setting that retains unique values. Okay, now let's move on and look at how we can change the default pivot table settings. So if you have Excel 365 or Excel 2019 or later, then it's possible to change the default pivot table settings. And this ensures that every pivot table that we create going forwards will have this setting automatically applied. So to do this, from the ribbon at the top, click File, and then come down to Options. In the Excel Options window, click on the Data option, and there we have this button here. So make changes to the default layout of pivot tables, and I'll click the Edit Default Layout button. In there we can see some of the default options that we might want to apply, but for this specific scenario I'm going to click on Pivot Table Options, and again in the Pivot Table Options dialog box I'll select the Data tab and I'll change that same field to None. I'll click OK to close that, OK to close that, and OK to close that. So that means the next pivot tables that we create going forwards will no longer retain any of those missing items. So let's try that out. I'll select a cell within my data, click Insert, Pivot Table, and I'm going to place that just below the existing pivot table, and then select OK. I can drag category into the rows and value into the value section. I'll right click on my pivot table, select pivot table options, then I'll select data, and as you can see, the number of items to retain per field already say none. I'll click cancel on that just to close that window there. Finally, let's look at how we can change this setting using VBA macros. Okay, so for both pivot tables on this sheet, I've gone ahead and changed them back to being automatic. So as you can see there, that drop down says automatic. I'll press Alt F11 to open up the Visual Basic editor. And the first macro there that you can see will change the setting to the currently selected pivot table. If you want to copy and paste this code, you can follow the link in the descriptions box to the blog post, and that contains a copy of the code there. The code is also available in the example file. So let's try and run this clear old PT items active macro. So I've selected my pivot table. As I said, pivot table options, and data currently shows that as being automatic. I'll select developer, macros. Here's my clear old PT items active. When I click run on that, should have changed that setting. Let's check. There we go, that setting has now been changed to none, which means none of those historic items will be retained. Then Alt F11 to go back into the Visual Basic editor. And we have a second macro there that applies this setting to all the macros in the current workbook. Again, if you want to copy that code, you can either find it in the example file or in the blog post, both of which are linked to in the descriptions box. I'll close that. And from there, I can go developer, macros, clear old pivot item tables in the workbook, select run. So that should have now changed the option in this pivot table as well. There we go. So that pivot table has also been changed to none. So while this macro option isn't as convenient as changing the default settings, if you have Excel 2016 and before, then that's an option you can take to easily change the settings for all of your pivot tables. So that's it for this video. It turns out it's just one pesky setting that causes all of those redundant items to appear. But thankfully, you've now looked at 3 ways of changing that setting. So we can change it manually, we can change it in our default settings, or we can change it with a macro. So hopefully this should no longer be an issue for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.